The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. The glass walls of the penthouse shimmered with the silver reflection of city lights, while thunder rolled far away like the low growl of something ancient. Inside, everything was quiet, too quiet. Alexander Grayson, the billionaire CEO of Grayson Industries, sat alone on the edge of his grand piano bench, staring into the distance. The flicker of the fireplace painted his face in shades of gold and shadow, revealing a man who had everything, and nothing at all. He had built an empire from the ground up. Power, respect, luxury. These were things he commanded with ease. Yet, beneath that commanding exterior lived a loneliness he would never admit, not even to himself. People loved his money, not the man behind it. That truth haunted him. His fingers traced the rim of his glass absent-mindedly as his butler, Morris, cleared the dinner plates from the dining table. Only one person remained in the room besides him. A young woman with soft eyes and quiet steps, her name barely ever spoken, Lena. She was the newest maid in the Grayson household, hired only a month ago. Barely 24, shy to the point of invisibility, she rarely met Alexander's eyes. She moved like a whisper. Graceful, almost afraid of taking up too much space. Alexander had noticed her from the very first day. There was something different about her. She wasn't like the others. She didn't hover, didn't try to impress him, didn't seek attention. She simply did her job. And somehow, that made him notice her even more. Tonight, however, something stirred in him. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the echo of loneliness in this cold mansion. Or maybe it was curiosity. Curiosity about whether anyone in this world would care for him without knowing he was watching. "Leave everything, Morris," Alexander said suddenly, his tone distant. "You may go for the night." Morris hesitated, surprised. "Sir, Miss Lena hasn't finished her duties." "I said go," Alexander repeated, softer this time but firm. Lena froze, clutching a cloth in her hands, unsure whether she should leave too. But then Alexander stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the marble floor. His voice came again, low and deliberate. "You stay." Her heart jumped. "Why, yes, sir." He walked toward the long couch near the fire and sat down, reclining slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he closed his eyes. Lena stood still, confused. Had he fallen asleep? That quickly? She looked toward the door where Morris had exited, but it was too late. The billionaire seemed lost in slumber, his chest rising and falling evenly. What she didn't know was that Alexander wasn't sleeping at all. Behind his closed eyes, he listened. Waiting, observing. He had done this before, though never with her. Sometimes, when he wanted to test his staff, to see who respected him when he wasn't looking, he would pretend to fall asleep. It was a strange quirk, perhaps even cruel, but it was the only way he trusted people through deception. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain and the faint ticking of the antique clock. Lena tiptoed around the room, carefully collecting empty glasses and wiping the table. Every now and then, her gaze lingered on him. On his tired face, his half-open collar, the tension that never seemed to leave his brow. Her movements were delicate, reverent even. She hesitated before picking up his glass, then whispered almost to herself. "He works too hard." Alexander's heart skipped. No one had ever said that. Not out of concern, at least. She went to the piano, her fingers grazing the dust along the edges. Then she did something he did not expect. She sat down and pressed a single key, softly, like she was afraid the sound might wake him. The note lingered, trembling in the silence. Then another note. And another. The melody that followed was hauntingly gentle. A lullaby, uncertain but beautiful. Alexander recognized it immediately. It was the same tune his mother used to hum when he was a boy. Before life became about numbers and power. Lena's voice joined the piano, barely above a whisper, trembling with emotion. "Sleep now, restless heart, the storm will fade away." He felt something tighten in his chest. The song filled the cold space between them, warm and fragile. For the first time in years, he felt peace creeping in. When the song ended, Lena remained still, her head bowed, as if ashamed of her own courage. Then she stood, walked to the couch where he slept, and gently draped a blanket over him. Her fingers brushed his shoulder for a fleeting moment. "You look lonely," she murmured softly, "even in your dreams." And with that, she turned to leave. Alexander's breath caught. Her words pierced deeper than she could have imagined. He felt a sudden urge to open his eyes, to speak, to tell her he wasn't asleep. But something stopped him. He needed to know more. Who was this girl who saw through the armor no one else could? As the door clicked shut behind her, Alexander opened his eyes at last. For the first time in a long while, there were tears in them. Tears he couldn't explain. Outside, the storm began to ease. But inside him, another kind of storm had just begun. The next morning, the world seemed quieter. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the rising sun. The city outside the penthouse stirred to life. But inside, Alexander Grayson's mind was still trapped in the night before. He sat at the breakfast table, staring at the untouched coffee before him. The taste of sleep never came to him after what he heard. The sound of her voice, fragile yet filled with something he hadn't felt in years, genuine care. Lena. He whispered her name under his breath, testing the weight of it, the way it felt in his mouth. Soft. Real. It didn't belong in the world of contracts and boardrooms. It belonged in the quiet moments between thunder and heartbeats. Morris entered, as punctual as ever. "Good morning, sir. Your meeting with the investors is scheduled for 10. Shall I have the car ready?" Alexander blinked, his thoughts returning reluctantly to reality. "Yes. But Morris," he said, pausing. "The maid Lena. How long has she been working here?" "Just over a month, sir. Came through a small agency. Quiet girl. Does her work without complaint." "Shall I?" "No." Alexander's voice came sharper than intended. "Don't say anything to her. Not yet." Morris nodded politely, masking his curiosity. When he left, Alexander leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline. He didn't understand why her small act of kindness affected him so deeply. He'd been surrounded by hundreds of people. Employees, assistants, admirers. But no one had ever looked at him the way she did that night. Not with fear or admiration, but with sadness. As if she saw something human in him. By the afternoon, he couldn't resist any longer. He called for her. When Lena entered his office, her eyes were wide with uncertainty. She stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. "You wanted to see me, sir." Alexander didn't look up at first. He was standing by the large window, the light framing him like a portrait. "Yes," he said slowly. "Come in." Her steps were hesitant. He turned finally, studying her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Tell me, Miss Lena," he said, his voice measured, "do you often sing while you work?" Her cheeks turned pink instantly. Oh no, sir. I didn't mean to. It was late, and you were asleep. I thought no one could hear me. I'm so sorry." "Sorry." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For playing the piano in my house." Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked utterly mortified. Alexander smiled faintly. "A rare sight. Relax. You play beautifully." The words hit her like a shock. "Thank you, sir. My mother used to sing that song when I was a child." "I didn't mean to intrude." He watched her carefully. There was something in the way she said, "Mother." A tremor, a longing. He understood it far too well. "What happened to her?" he asked softly. Lena hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "She passed away 2 years ago." "I'm sorry." She nodded once, biting her lip. "It's all right. She always said music keeps the soul warm, even when the world is cold." Her words lingered. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt fragile. Too honest for a world built on power and pretense. Alexander finally broke the silence. "You're very different from most people here," he said. Lena blinked. "Is that bad?" "Not at all," he said. His tone softer than she'd ever heard it. "It's just unusual." He didn't tell her the real reason he called her in. He didn't mention the blanket, the whisper, or the way her touch had stayed with him through the night. That secret stayed locked inside him. For now. When she left, Alexander found himself smiling faintly. Something that felt foreign to his face. But beneath that smile was confusion. He didn't know what he was doing, or why her presence unsettled him in a way no business rival ever could. Days passed, and something subtle began to change in the mansion. He found excuses to be around her. Asking for coffee when he never drank any past noon, calling her into his office under the pretext of trivial matters. And each time, he noticed more. The small scar near her wrist. The way she hummed quietly while folding linens. The distant sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. But one night, curiosity turned into something else. It was late again, another storm whispering outside. Alexander had been working for hours, his desk drowning in files. When he finally left his office, he found Lena in the kitchen, cleaning dishes by hand. Everyone else had gone. "Still here?" he asked, leaning on the doorway. She jumped slightly, turning around. "Oh, I didn't realize you were awake, sir. I was just finishing these before leaving." He stepped closer. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know." She smiled faintly. I don't mind. It keeps me calm. Alexander watched her hands move through the water. Small, careful hands that had probably known more hardship than they deserved. Then he said it. Almost without thinking, "You think I'm lonely?" Her hands froze. She looked up startled. "Sir. Last week," he said quietly, "you told me I looked lonely in my sleep." Color drained from her face. Sir, I didn't mean. I thought you were asleep, I swear." He raised a hand, stopping her. "I wasn't. I heard everything." The air between them grew heavy. She looked mortified, on the verge of tears. "Please, I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I'll pack my things." "Stop." His voice softened suddenly. "You weren't wrong." Her lips parted in confusion. Alexander took a step closer. For once, there was no power in his stance, only honesty. "You saw something no one else ever did." "Maybe that's what scared me most." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the rain outside. Then, in a whisper barely audible, Lena said, "Everyone gets lonely, sir. Even the ones who look like they never should." Alexander's breath trembled. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that. And for the first time in years, he smiled. Not out of politeness, but from somewhere deeper. That night lingered in Alexander's mind like a song that refused to fade. He told himself it was nothing. A passing exchange, a simple moment of honesty. But the truth was undeniable. Lena had begun to break through the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. In the days that followed, something shifted in the mansion. The staff noticed it first. The subtle softening in their employer's tone, the faint smiles where once there had only been curt nods. He began coming home earlier. The usual edge in his voice dulled. But the real change was in his eyes. They no longer looked past people, they saw them. Still, Alexander didn't quite understand what was happening inside him. A part of him was terrified. Terrified of caring again, of being seen, of feeling something he couldn't control. One evening, a week later, he found himself walking down the servants' hallway. A part of the house he had never entered. He paused before a small wooden door, faintly lit from within. Through the narrow gap, he saw her, sitting cross-legged on her narrow bed, a worn notebook in her lap, humming softly as she wrote. Her hair was loose, tumbling around her shoulders. She looked peaceful. He should have turned back. But something about her stillness, her unguardedness, drew him in. He knocked lightly. Lena jumped up, startled, her notebook slipping from her hands. Mr. Grayson." "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, sir." "I didn't hear." Alexander stepped inside, holding up a hand. "Relax, Lena. You don't need to be afraid of me." Her cheeks turned pink. "I just didn't expect you here." He smiled faintly. "Neither did I." His eyes drifted to the notebook lying open on the bed. "What's that?" "Oh, it's nothing, sir. Just something I write in when I can't sleep. May I?" She hesitated, then nodded nervously. He picked it up gently. Inside were pages filled with delicate handwriting, poems, reflections, even sketches. One page caught his attention, a simple drawing of the piano in the main hall, surrounded by tiny musical notes. Beneath it, a single line read, "Even broken hearts can still make beautiful music." Alexander's throat tightened. He closed the notebook carefully and handed it back. "You write beautifully." Her eyes flickered with surprise. "Thank you. It's just a way to escape, I guess." "From what?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "From life. From silence. From people who only see what I do. Not who I am." The irony hit him like a blade. That was exactly what he'd done to every person around him. Reduced them to function, to performance, to purpose. Never to people. "I understand," he said softly. Lena looked up, uncertain if he really could. But in that moment, his eyes told her everything. They stood there, suspended in silence. Until Alexander finally stepped back. "I'll let you rest. Good night, Lena," she smiled. A small, genuine curve of the lips that reached her eyes. "Good night, sir." As he walked back to his suite, Alexander felt the unfamiliar ache of something long dormant. Not just affection, but admiration. For her strength, her quiet courage. Her ability to find light in the places he only saw shadows. Over the next few days, they began to speak more often. Small conversations at first. About music, the weather, little things. But each word built a fragile thread between them, something that neither dared to name. Until one evening, when everything changed. Alexander had invited a group of executives to the mansion for dinner. It was a night of formalities. Laughter that wasn't real, toasts that masked envy, and smiles sharp enough to cut. Lena and the other staff moved quietly through the crowd, serving drinks and refilling glasses. But Alexander wasn't listening to the conversations. His eyes kept finding her. Across the room, near the grand staircase, in the flicker of candlelight, one of the guests, a brash man named Carter, leaned toward Alexander, chuckling. "I must say, Grayson, your staff is exquisite. That little maid of yours, what's her name?" "Lena. Quite the charming thing." Alexander's jaw tensed. "She's not for your entertainment, Carter." Carter smirked. "Relax. I was only admiring the view." The laughter that followed felt like acid. Later that night, when most of the guests had gone and the last of the glasses had been cleared, Alexander found Lena in the hall, her expression shaken. Carter had cornered her earlier. Said something crude, though she'd tried to brush it off. When Alexander saw the tear in her sleeve and the tremor in her hands, something inside him snapped. "Who did this?" His voice was low, dangerous. Lena tried to smile, to diffuse him. "It's nothing. Sir. Please, I don't want trouble." "Ooh," he repeated, stepping closer. "Mr. Carter," she whispered finally. "But please, don't, he didn't hurt me. Just words." Alexander's fists clenched. Words can wound deeper than anything else. She looked at him then, her eyes shimmering with an emotion he couldn't name. "You don't have to protect me, sir, I'm just—" "You're not just anything," he interrupted, his voice raw. "You're someone, Lena. Someone worth respect." For a moment, time stopped. The way he said her name, not as an employer, but as a man who saw her, made her heart pound. "I'm fine," she said softly, though her voice trembled. "You don't have to care." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "I already do." Her eyes widened. Silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. The world outside the window was dark, but inside, something burned brighter than fire, fragile, forbidden, and undeniably real. For the first time in years, Alexander Grayson felt powerless. Powerless not because of failure or defeat, but because of what he was beginning to feel for the quiet, unassuming maid who'd somehow stepped past the walls surrounding his heart. That night after everyone had left, he couldn't sleep. He paced near the fireplace, his mind a storm of emotions he didn't know how to name. He was a man used to control. Control of his company, his image, his future. But no amount of wealth or authority could silence the sound of her trembling voice echoing in his head. "You don't have to care." And yet, he did. More than he ever should. By morning, he made a decision. He needed distance. For her sake, and his. He convinced himself it was the right thing to do. But when Lena entered the room to serve breakfast, smiling politely, he felt the ache of that choice before even making it. "Good morning, sir." She greeted softly, her voice still carrying that gentleness that disarmed him. He nodded stiffly. "Good morning. You may leave the tray and go." She hesitated, surprised by the sudden coldness in his tone. "Of course, sir." Their eyes met briefly. His guarded, hers searching. Before she turned away. When she left, the silence that followed was unbearable. Days passed like that. Alexander buried himself in work, avoiding the mansion as much as possible. Meetings, travel, endless paperwork. Anything to drown the thoughts that kept circling in his mind. But the more he tried to push her away, the more her image followed him. Her voice. Her smile. The way she looked at him, not as a billionaire, not as a boss, but as a man. Meanwhile, Lena sensed the shift immediately. The warmth that had grown between them vanished overnight. He no longer sought her out, no longer asked about her day, no longer smiled. It was as if the connection they'd built had been erased. And though she told herself it didn't matter, that she was foolish for even noticing, her heart ached in ways she couldn't explain. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, she stood by the grand piano in the empty living room. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished surface, as she pressed a single key. The same note she'd played the night she thought he was asleep. The sound lingered in the air, a ghost of memory. "I shouldn't have sung that night," she whispered to herself. "Maybe then he wouldn't look at me differently." She didn't notice him standing in the doorway. Alexander watched her in silence, the flickering light outlining her figure against the piano. He had returned early that evening, exhausted and conflicted. Seeing her there, lost in thought, her sadness unguarded, hit him harder than he expected. "You play beautifully," he said softly. She startled, turning quickly. "Sir, I didn't hear you come in. I wasn't supposed to be here," he admitted. "But I wanted to be." There was a long pause. "Why are you avoiding me?" she asked quietly. The question came out more vulnerable than she intended. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I don't trust myself, Lena. Her brows furrowed. What do you mean? I mean. He took a step closer, his voice low. I've spent my entire life keeping people at arm's length. Everyone around me wants something. Money, power, opportunity. But you. He stopped himself, emotion thick in his throat. But me what? She asked, her eyes searching his face. You don't want anything from me, he said finally. And that terrifies me. Her breath caught. The rawness in his voice stripped away every layer of formality between them. Mr. Grayson. She whispered. You don't have to be afraid of being seen. He gave a broken laugh, half pain, half relief. If only it were that simple. They stood in silence for a moment. The storm outside began again. Soft rain tapping against the tall windows. Then, unexpectedly, Lena stepped forward. Do you know what my mother used to say? He shook his head. She said people build walls, not to keep others out, but to see who cares enough to break them down. Alexander's gaze softened. And what if no one ever does? Then maybe. She said gently. They were never meant to stay behind those walls in the first place. Her words hit him harder than she could know. He felt something inside him break. A quiet surrender he'd been fighting for years. He reached out, almost without realizing it, and brushed his fingers lightly against her hand. It was a brief touch, but it carried everything neither could say aloud. Lena, he began, his voice trembling, I don't know what this is between us. But it feels real. And that's something I haven't felt in a long time. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled softly. Sometimes real things aren't meant to last forever, sir. Sometimes they're just meant to remind us that we're still alive. He looked at her. Really looked. And saw not just the maid who worked in his home, but a woman who had taught him to feel again. Before he could respond, Morris entered the room unexpectedly, clearing his throat. Sir, I apologize for interrupting, but there's a call from the board. It's urgent. The moment shattered. Lena stepped back instantly, her face turning away. Alexander hesitated, torn between duty and desire. But in the end duty won. I'll be there, he said, his voice tight. When he looked back she was gone. He stood there for a long time, the faint melody of the piano still echoing through the empty hall. For the first time, Alexander Grayson, the man who once believed he needed no one, realized what it meant to be truly alone. And yet, deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Something in her eyes had promised there was still more to come. Even if neither of them knew how it would unfold. A week passed in uneasy silence. Alexander threw himself into work again, but his heart wasn't in it. Every deal felt hollow, every victory tasteless. The mansion that once stood as a monument to his success now felt like a cage. Echoing with the absence of a quiet voice, and the faint memory of a piano melody. He hadn't seen Lena since that night. She had taken a few days off. Morris had mentioned something about a sick relative. The news unsettled him more than he cared to admit. On the 6th day, he found himself standing in front of her small door again. It was closed, locked, the room empty. The bed neatly made, no trace of her warmth left behind. For a moment, he stood there lost, then, before he could stop himself, he whispered, "Come back." He didn't expect her to hear him. But somehow, he needed to say it aloud. If only to make it real. When she returned 2 days later, Alexander was in the garden, something he rarely visited. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the roses glistened from an earlier drizzle. He heard her voice before he saw her. Mr. Grayson. He turned, startled. She was standing by the path, her hair pulled back, a hint of tiredness under her eyes but that same gentle smile on her lips. Lena. Her name left his mouth like a breath he'd been holding too long. You're back. She nodded. Yes, sir. I didn't mean to stay away so long. My little brother was ill. He frowned slightly. You have a brother? Yes, she said softly. He's 16. I've been taking care of him since my parents passed. There was a quiet strength in her voice. The kind born of responsibility, of sacrifice. It made his chest ache. Is he all right now? He's getting better. She hesitated. Thank you for asking. For a moment, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to slow, the sound of distant thunder echoing softly in the air. Alexander finally said, I've missed your music. Lena's eyes widened slightly. You remember that? I remember everything, he admitted. Every note. Every word. Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away, unsure what to say. Then she smiled faintly. I can play again tonight, if you'd like. He almost said yes immediately, but something in her tone, something shy and tentative, made him pause. "Only if you want to," he said gently. "I do," she whispered. That night, the mansion glowed with soft lamplight. The storm returned, whispering against the windows, as if echoing the rhythm of what neither of them dared to say aloud. Lena sat at the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys. Alexander sat nearby, watching. Not as a master watching his servant, but as a man mesmerized by a soul he didn't deserve to touch. The melody began. Slow, delicate, filled with the ache of everything they couldn't say. As she played, Alexander's thoughts wandered. He remembered his mother's laughter, his father's harsh expectations, the endless years spent chasing perfection. And now, this. A simple song that felt more honest than all the success he'd ever known. When the final note faded, Lena looked up. Their eyes met. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, fragile as glass and just as real. Alexander rose slowly and approached her, the firelight reflected in his eyes, making them shimmer. "You make this house feel alive again," he said quietly. Lena smiled sadly. "It's not the house, sir. It's you. You're the one who's changing." He took a slow breath. "And if I told you that you're the reason for it?" Her lips parted, her voice trembling. "Then I'd say you don't need me to keep changing." He stared at her for a long moment. Wanting to believe that, yet knowing it wasn't true. Everything inside him screamed to close the distance between them, but something, fear, guilt, the cruel weight of their worlds, held him back. Then, as if fate itself decided to intervene, the door burst open. Morris stood there, breathless. "Sir, I'm sorry. There's an emergency. The board meeting tomorrow, there's been a leak. Someone's stolen internal documents." Alexander's jaw tightened. The spell between them shattered. "What? The media's already asking questions. They're naming you directly." The old world rushed back in. Sharp, cold, and suffocating. Alexander's mind snapped into the ruthless focus of the CEO he'd been trained to be. "Get legal on the phone. I want every statement reviewed before sunrise," he ordered. "Yes, sir." Morris hurried out. Lena stood, startled by the sudden shift in him. "Sir, is everything okay?" He forced a thin smile, though his chest felt hollow. "It will be. Don't worry about it." She looked at him, seeing through the mask instantly. "You don't have to pretend with me." His voice softened, almost breaking. "That's the problem, Lena. With you I can't pretend." She stepped closer, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "Then don't." "Not tonight." But he couldn't. He turned away, the weight of his empire already dragging him back into the darkness he thought he'd escaped. When she finally left the room, he remained by the window, staring at the storm raging outside. Lightning flashed across the skyline, and in that flash he saw himself. A man who had everything, yet stood on the edge of losing the only thing that mattered. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Grayson was afraid. Not of failure, not of scandal, but of losing the one person who had taught him how to feel human again. The next morning came not with sunlight, but with chaos. Alexander's company was under siege. News channels screamed headlines about leaked documents, alleged corruption, and insider deals that painted Grayson Industries in scandalous colors. Investors panicked. Shares plunged. Lawyers flooded his office. But in the middle of that whirlwind, Alexander wasn't thinking about the money or the empire. He was thinking about her. Because deep down, he knew. When storms hit, money wasn't what you needed. People were. And Lena had somehow become his calm in every storm. He hadn't seen her since the night before. The staff whispered that she'd left early. Her brother's condition worsening. But he couldn't shake the fear that maybe, just maybe, he had driven her away. That she'd seen the darkness surrounding him and chosen to escape it. By late afternoon, his board of directors sat in a long, tense line across the conference table. His lawyers explained the crisis in cold, polished words. They urged him to blame someone, to issue statements, to cut ties. But Alexander barely heard them. His thoughts were elsewhere, in a quiet mansion, beside a piano that now stood silent. Finally, one of the directors snapped, "Alexander, are you even listening? If we don't act now, everything you built could fall apart." He looked up slowly, his voice calm but steady. "Then let it fall." The room froze. "I built this company to feel powerful," he continued. "But all it ever did was make me forget what really matters. Maybe it's time I remember." He stood, leaving their stunned faces behind, and walked out. The decision had been made. Hours later, the city had fallen into dusk. He drove himself through the rain, no driver, no entourage. Just him, the road, and the ache in his chest. He stopped at the small, run-down neighborhood on the east side. The kind of place no billionaire was ever seen. The lights flickered. The streets were narrow and cracked. He found the address he'd been given by one of the staff. Lena's home. He stood at the door for a long moment before knocking. When it opened, Lena's brother appeared, pale, thin, but smiling faintly. "Can I help you, sir?" Alexander hesitated. "Is your sister home?" The boy nodded and called out, "Lina, it's the man from your work." She appeared moments later, dressed simply, her eyes tired but still warm. For a heartbeat they just stared at each other. Two worlds colliding in silence. "Mr. Grayson," she said softly. "What are you doing here?" "I had to see you." "Is something wrong?" He shook his head. "Everything's wrong. But seeing you makes it right again." Her eyes widened, and she stepped aside. "Please, come in." The small home was modest. A single room with old furniture, walls faded from time, and the faint scent of tea and laundry soap. But it felt alive in a way his mansion never had. He looked around, then back at her. "So this is where you find your peace." She smiled faintly. "It's not much, but it's home." "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. For a long while, neither spoke. The rain outside softened, drumming gently on the roof. Then Alexander said quietly, "Lena, I came because I owe you the truth. I've spent my life pretending. Pretending to be untouchable, unfeeling, untouchable by the world. But you saw through all of it. You saw me." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "You were never invisible, sir. You were just hidden behind too much pain." He nodded slowly. "And you helped me remember what it feels like to be human." She shook her head. "I didn't do anything special." "You did everything," he said, his voice thick. "You were kind when you didn't have to be. You cared when no one else did. And I." He hesitated, emotion choking his words. "I pretended to sleep that night because I didn't trust anyone. I wanted to test you. But what you did, your song, your words, they broke something open in me." Lena blinked, realizing at last what had happened. "You were awake." He nodded. Every word, every note. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain. Then a tear slipped down her cheek. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't know how to thank you," he said softly. "You reminded me that love doesn't need to be earned. It just is." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And what now?" He stepped closer, his voice trembling but certain. "No, I stop pretending. I face what I become. I rebuild, not the company, but myself." Lina smiled through her tears. "You don't need me for that, Alexander." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But I'd like to have you by my side anyway." The honesty in his tone made her heart ache. She took a step closer, close enough to feel his warmth. "And what if the world doesn't understand?" "Then the world can wait," he said. "Because for once I do." Outside, the rain stopped. The clouds parted, letting a soft glow spill through the window. Pale light reflecting off their faces, warm and new. Lena took his hand gently. "Then start over," she whispered. "Not as the man everyone fears, but as the man who listens when the world goes quiet." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. And as the two of them stood there, a billionaire and a maid, stripped of titles and pretense, the world outside finally seemed still. Weeks later, the headlines changed. The investigation cleared him. Grayson Industries recovered, stronger and humbler. But more importantly, Alexander changed. He opened new programs for his workers, funded shelters, and began every morning with a single melody. The one Lena had played that first night. Sometime, in the quiet hours, she would join him at the piano. And together they would play. Not for wealth, not for reputation, but for peace. Because in the end, it wasn't power that saved Alexander Grayson. It was kindness. It was music. It was love, quiet, steadfast, and real.